I never thought I'd become that kind of wife, the suspicious, overly analytical one who second-guesses every word, every glance, every laugh. But here I was, a tangled mess of emotions, sitting in the dim light of our bedroom, dissecting every interaction my husband had with her. Her name was Claire, the childhood best friend, the constant reference point in so many of my husband's stories. At first I thought it was charming, how he spoke of her with such warmth. They had grown up together, 2 kids in the same sleepy neighborhood, riding bikes until the streetlights flickered on. Their mothers were friends. They'd had playdates, swapped lunches, and probably even whispered secrets under the stars. I imagined them as characters from a coming-of-age movie, and when he shared his stories, I loved seeing this nostalgic side of him. But over time, the mentions of Claire started to accumulate. At first it was casual. Claire used to say this, or Claire once tried that. Harmless, right? Everyone has a past, and I wasn't the jealous type. But then the stories became more frequent. I'd hear, Claire always knew the best coffee spots, or Claire could solve a Rubik's Cube in under a minute. His tone when he spoke about her was almost reverent, a soft admiration that I brushed off at first. She was just his friend, I told myself. Someone who had simply been there through the years, a vestige of his childhood that hadn't entirely faded away. It wasn't until I met her that the unease began to grow. She was striking, not in an obvious bombshell kind of way, but in the way she carried herself. Confidence, understated yet magnetic. She had this effortless ability to fill a room, as if everyone naturally gravitated toward her. And my husband was no exception. The first time we all had dinner together, I watched as they laughed about old inside jokes, their voices overlapping like they were the only 2 people at the table. She leaned in as she spoke, her green eyes sparkling, and I couldn't help but feel like I was intruding on something intimate, something private. Still, I didn't want to seem insecure. I smiled, nodded, even laughed at their stories. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was an invisible thread between them. A connection that I could never fully understand because I wasn't part of their shared history. I was the outsider. The real cracks in my composure began to show a few months later. Started with small things. My husband, Eric, came home one day wearing a jacket I didn't recognize. When I asked about it, he casually mentioned that Claire had recommended the brand. "She's always been into this kind of stuff," he said with a shrug, as if it were nothing. But then there were the phrases. Expressions that I'd never heard him use before started slipping into his vocabulary. He'd make a joke and I'd laugh only to hear him say, "That's classic Claire." And his sense of humor, it was subtle but it was changing. The kind of sarcastic wit he never used before was now part of his repertoire. And I realized with a sickening clarity that it was hers. The tipping point came when I noticed his wardrobe shifting. Claire had a distinctive style, neutral tones, minimalist cuts, always effortlessly polished. Eric, who had never cared much about clothes, suddenly started dressing like he had stepped out of her closet. One evening, as we were getting ready for dinner, he walked out wearing a tailored beige sweater and slim-fit jeans. It was an uncanny replica of something Claire had worn the last time we saw her. My breath caught in my throat. "Do you like it?" he asked, oblivious to my internal turmoil. I forced a smile. "It's nice. Different. Different. That's what everything felt like lately. Different and yet somehow the same." I began to notice other little things, how he'd light up when she texted, the way he'd casually drop her name in conversation, the way he seemed more attentive, more animated whenever she was around. One night, as we were lying in bed, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Do you think about her a lot?" I blurted out, my voice trembling. Eric turned to me, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "Claire," I said, barely above a whisper. "You mention her all the time. You dress like her. You even talk like her. It's like she's always there." His face softened, but I could see the flicker of defensiveness in his eyes. "She's my friend," he said. "You know that. We've been friends forever. That doesn't mean anything." But it did. At least it did to me. I didn't want to admit it, to him or to myself, but I felt like I was losing him to her. Not in the way people lose their spouses to affairs or betrayals, but in a quieter, more insidious way. She was part of his past, yes, but she was also creeping into our present. And I couldn't compete with the weight of all those years, with the memories they shared. with the person she had helped him become. The worst part was I didn't think he even realized it. To him it was harmless, just a friendship, just nostalgia, just Claire. But to me it felt like a shadow hanging over us, growing larger with every laugh, every text, every subtle shift in him that reminded me of her. I wish I could say I confronted him, that I demanded answers or set boundaries. But the truth is I didn't know how. How do you fight a ghost? How do you explain to your husband that the person he's known since he was a kid, the person he trusts, admires, even adores, is slowly coming between you? I lay awake most nights, the question gnawing at me: was I overreacting? Or was there something real, something dangerous, about the way he seemed to mirror her? The way her presence loomed over us like an unspoken promise of something more? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that I was losing pieces of him, little fragments slipping away one by one, and I wasn't sure if I could ever get them back. The days blurred into weeks, but the weight of Claire never left me. It clung to the corners of my mind, a constant nagging presence. I started to watch Eric more closely, not out of malice or mistrust, but out of desperation. I was searching for signs. Anything that would confirm or disprove the fears that kept me awake at night. Was he still mine? Or had I unknowingly been pushed to the periphery of his world? The hardest part was how normal everything seemed on the surface. Eric was still attentive, kind, and loving in the ways he always had been. He didn't hide his phone, didn't pull away from me when I reached for his hand, didn't miss our date nights. But there were moments, small fleeting moments, where I felt the shift. Like when he'd pause before answering a question about Claire, or when he seemed distracted, his gaze distant, as if his mind was somewhere I couldn't follow. Then there were the texts. I never intended to look. I told myself it wasn't who I was. But one evening as Eric showered, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. My heart pounded as I glanced at the screen. Claire, you're the only one who gets it. The words were innocent enough, but they sent a jolt through me. Gets what? What was so special, so unique that only Eric could understand? My fingers itched to unlock the phone, to scroll through their conversations, to uncover what had been hidden in plain sight. But I stopped myself, the shame of my own paranoia rooting me in place. When Eric came out of the shower, I tried to act normal. But I must have failed because he paused, towel slung over his shoulder, and frowned at me. You okay? He asked. Yeah. I lied, my voice too bright, too casual. Just tired. But the truth was I was anything but okay. That one message had cracked something open inside me. I began to notice every interaction between them with fresh eyes. When Claire called, Eric's voice would take on a tone I didn't hear with anyone else. A softness, a familiarity. When we saw her in person, he seemed more alive, more himself. And it wasn't just him. Claire, too, seemed to have a way of leaning into him, her hand brushing his arm as she laughed, her gaze lingering a second too long. Was I imagining it? Or was there something in her eyes, something in the way she tilted her head when she spoke to him that hinted at more? I hated how it made me feel jealous, insecure, like a stranger in my own marriage. But I couldn't let it go. One afternoon when Eric was out running errands, I decided to call Claire. It wasn't planned. My hand just moved to my phone, as if it had a mind of its own. She picked up on the second ring, her voice light and cheerful. Hey, this is a surprise, she said. Everything okay? There was no malice in her tone, no hint of guilt or discomfort. She sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me, and for a moment I felt ridiculous. What was I even hoping to achieve with this call? But I pushed forward. I just wanted to talk, I said hesitantly, about you and Eric. There was a pause, just long enough for my chest to tighten, but then she laughed softly. What about us? Her casual response only fueled my frustration. You're very close, I said carefully, trying to keep my tone neutral. Sometimes it feels like there's something I'm missing. Claire was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was calm but firm. We've been friends forever, you know that. Eric and I have a lot of history, but that's all it is, history. You don't have to worry about me. It should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. There was something in the way she said it, something in her choice of words that didn't sit right with me. You don't have to worry about me. Not us. Me. Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you'd stayed together? I blurted out before I could stop myself. She didn't deny it. Instead, she let out a soft sigh. We were kids. It's not the same now. He loves you, you know. He talks about you all the time. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to let her words soothe the storm raging inside me. But they didn't. They only made me feel worse. Because if Eric talked about me so much, if he loved me so completely, then why did it feel like he was slipping away? Over the next few weeks, I tried to focus on us, on our marriage, on the life we'd built together. I planned little surprises, cooked his favorite meals, even suggested a weekend getaway. Eric was thrilled, or at least he seemed to be. But even in those quiet, intimate moments, I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire was there, hovering like a ghost between us. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening. We were hosting a small dinner party, just a few close friends. Claire was, of course, among the guests. She arrived wearing a dress I'd complimented weeks ago, her hair styled effortlessly, her smile radiant. Eric's face lit up the moment he saw her, and I felt my chest tighten. As the night went on, I couldn't help but notice how they gravitated toward each other. They weren't being inappropriate, at least not overtly, but their connection was palpable. The way they finished each other's sentences, the way they laughed at jokes no one else understood, the way they seemed to share a language all their own. At one point, I caught Claire watching Eric from across the room. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a softness in her eyes that made my stomach churn. Was it longing? Regret? I didn't know, and I hated myself for even wondering. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I finally broke. "Do you still love her?" I asked, my voice trembling. Eric froze, his glass of water halfway to his lips. "What?" "Claire," I said, my eyes welling with tears. "Do you still love her? 'Cause if you do, I need to know." "I can't keep." "I don't," he interrupted, setting the glass down with a thud. "I don't love her. Not like that." "But you love her," I pressed, my voice cracking. "In some way you do. And it's too much. It's more than friendship, Eric. I can feel it." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. "She's important to me," he admitted. "She always has been. But that doesn't mean I love her more than I love you." "Then why does it feel like you're choosing her?" I whispered, the words barely audible. Eric stared at me, his expression unreadable. And in that moment, I realized that I might never get the answer I was looking for. Because some connections, no matter how innocent or unintentional, run too deep to fully untangle. And maybe that was the real truth I'd been avoiding all along. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over an endless abyss. I was trying to regain my footing, to find some semblance of balance in our marriage, but every step felt precarious, as if one wrong move would send me tumbling into the unknown. Eric's words that night lingered in my mind, looping endlessly. "She's important to me. Not you're the most important. Not I choose you. Just important." And what was I to him? His wife, yes. His partner, his confidant. But was I still the center of his universe? Or had Claire's gravitational pull shifted everything? I found myself second-guessing even the most mundane moments between us. When he smiled at me, was it real? Or was it something he'd learned to mimic? When he kissed me goodnight, was he thinking of me? Or was she still haunting his mind? Claire was haunting mine. I started dreaming about her, vivid and cruel dreams that left me breathless in the mornings. In one, I walked into a coffee shop to find her sitting at a table with Eric. They were holding hands, their heads bowed together as if sharing a secret. When they looked up and saw me, Claire smiled. A knowing, pitying smile that felt like a knife in my chest. I woke up gasping, clutching the sheets like they were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The tension between Eric and me was palpable, though we both pretended otherwise. He tried to act normal, overcompensating with sweet gestures, bringing me coffee in bed, texting me during the day to ask how I was feeling. And for a while I let myself believe it was enough. But deep down, I knew these were just band-aids on a wound that wouldn't heal. Then one day, everything came to a head. It was a Friday evening, and Eric had mentioned that Claire needed help moving some furniture in her apartment. "She's switching bedrooms," he'd said casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I told her I'd stop by after work to give her a hand. I froze mid-step, the laundry basket in my arms suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. "You're going alone?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. He looked up from his phone, frowning. "Yeah, it's just moving a bed frame and some shelves." It's not a big deal. Not a big deal, I repeated, setting the basket down. You're spending your Friday night with her. And it's not a big deal? Eric sighed, running a hand over his face. Megan, come on. It's not like that. She needed help and I said yes. What's the issue? The issue, I snapped, my voice rising, is that you always say yes to her. Whatever she needs, you're there. You drop everything for her like she's your priority. And I'm supposed to just accept it. His expression hardened, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. She's my friend. I've told you this 1,000 times. Why do you keep making it into something it's not? Because it feels like something it is. I shot back, my chest heaving with the weight of everything I'd been holding in. You don't see it, Eric, but you treat her differently. You light up when she's around. You mimic her jokes, her style, you even talk like her now. And it feels like I'm losing you to someone who isn't even trying to take you. Eric stared at me, stunned into silence. For a moment I thought he might argue, might try to deny what I just said. But instead he turned away, his jaw tightening. I can't do this right now, he muttered, grabbing his keys from the counter. Of course you can't, I said bitterly. You're too busy running to her. He froze in the doorway, his back to me. For a moment I thought he might say something, but then he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there, trembling, the weight of his absence pressing down on me like a physical force. He hadn't even tried to defend himself, and that silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Eric didn't come home until late that night. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard the front door open and close softly. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if he were trying not to wake me. But I wasn't asleep. I'd been replaying our argument in my mind over and over, dissecting every word, every pause, every glance. When he slipped into bed beside me, the mattress dipping under his weight, I couldn't stay silent. Did you have fun? I asked, my voice cold. He sighed heavily, his back to me. Megan, please. Can we not do this right now? Why not? I said, sitting up. You clearly had the energy to spend your evening with her. Why don't you have the energy to talk to me? Eric rolled over to face me, his expression weary. Because I'm tired, Megan. I'm tired of this constant suspicion, this constant questioning. Claire is my friend. That's all she's ever been, and all she'll ever be. Then why do I feel like I'm competing with her? I whispered, my voice breaking. Why do I feel like she's more important to you than I am? You're not competing, he said softly, reaching for my hand. You're my wife. You're my everything. Then prove it, I said, pulling my hand away. Prove it by setting boundaries. Prove it by choosing me every time without hesitation. Because right now it doesn't feel like you are. Eric's eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something crack in his resolve. But then he shook his head, a pained expression crossing his face. I don't know how to do that, he admitted. And there it was. The truth. He didn't know how to let Claire go, not because he loved her, but because she was a part of him. She was woven into the fabric of his life, and untangling her would mean unraveling parts of himself. The weeks that followed were a blur of tense silences and half-hearted attempts at normalcy. Eric promised he would see Claire less, but I could tell it wasn't easy for him. He'd come home restless, his phone lighting up with her name more often than I cared to admit. I tried to fill the space between us, to remind him of what we had, but it always felt like I was fighting against a tide too strong to hold back. One day I found myself standing in front of a mirror, staring at my reflection. I looked tired, worn down by the weight of everything I'd been carrying. And in that moment I realized something that shook me to my core. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep letting Claire's presence consume me. Couldn't keep fighting for a man who didn't seem to realize the battle I was waging. Something had to change. And maybe that something was me. The realization settled over me like a cold, damp fog. Heavy, unavoidable, and suffocating. If Eric wasn't going to fight for us, then maybe I had to stop fighting too. Maybe I had to accept that whatever we had, whatever we'd built together, wasn't enough to hold him completely in my orbit. And if that was true, then I had to decide. Was I willing to keep sharing him, even in this intangible way, or was it time to walk away? But walking away was easier said than done. It wasn't just Eric I'd be leaving. It was the life we'd built together. the future we dreamed of, the quiet moments that still felt like home. I hated Claire for making me feel this way, for forcing me into this corner, even if she didn't know she was doing it. And maybe that was the cruelest part of all. I wasn't sure if she even realized the damage she was causing. A part of me wanted to confront her again, to lay everything bare. To say, you've had him as your friend for decades. Why can't you let me have him as my husband? But what would that accomplish? If Eric didn't see the problem, if he didn't feel the weight of her presence the way I did, then my words would only come off as jealous rambling. I didn't want to be the villain in this story, but I was starting to feel like one. An insecure wife pitted against the flawless best friend. Instead of confronting her, I withdrew. From Eric, from Claire, from everything that reminded me of this impossible triangle. I spent more time at work, took long walks alone after dinner, and started filling my weekends with errands that didn't need to be done. First, Eric noticed. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table. His fork hovered over his plate, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "Just tired," I said, offering him a faint smile. It was the easiest lie to tell. He didn't push, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes lingered on me like he was trying to decipher a language he no longer understood. Maybe he was. Maybe we'd been speaking past each other for too long. The next turning point came one rainy Saturday afternoon. Eric was in the garage, tinkering with his tools, and I was curled up on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I glanced at the screen to see Claire's name. "Claire. Hey, are you free to grab coffee? I feel like we haven't talked in forever." I stared at the message, my stomach twisting into knots. Why was she texting me? Was this guilt? A peace offering? Or did she genuinely think we could maintain some kind of friendship despite the growing chasm she'd helped carve into my marriage? After a long moment, I typed out a response. "Me sure. Where do you want to meet?" We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. Claire was already seated when I arrived, a mug of something steaming in front of her. She looked up and smiled as I approached, her expression open and warm. It was disarming how normal she seemed. "I'm glad you could make it," she said, gesturing to the seat across from her. I sat down, wrapping my hands around the cup the barista had handed me. The warmth seeped into my skin, but it did nothing to ease the chill in my chest. "What's on your mind?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. Claire tilted her head, studying me. "You seem distant lately." "I just wanted to check in." I let out a humorless laugh. "You wanted to check in on me?" Her brow furrowed, but she didn't flinch. "Yeah. Is that so hard to believe?" "Yes," I said bluntly. "It is. Because every time I look at you, all I can think about is how much space you take up in my marriage." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked genuinely stunned. But then she straightened, her expression shifting into something calmer, more measured. "Megan, I never meant to make you feel that way. Eric and I." "Eric and you," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "That's the problem. There's always an Eric and you. Inside jokes, shared stories, little moments that I'm not a part of. And I've tried to be okay with it. I've tried to tell myself it's just history. But it's not just history, is it? It's the present, too." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked down at her mug, her fingers tracing the rim. "He's my best friend," she said quietly. "He's been my best friend my whole life. But that doesn't mean I want to come between you." "Then step back," I said, my voice trembling. "Give us space. Let him be my husband without always being your whatever he is to you." Claire looked up, her green eyes shining with something that looked like guilt. "I didn't realize how much this was affecting you," she admitted. I don't know what I thought. I guess I assumed you were okay with it." "Well, I'm not," I said, my hands tightening around the mug. "And I don't think Eric even realizes how much of himself he's given to you. But I do. And I can't keep pretending it doesn't hurt." The silence between us was heavy. The kind of silence that feels like 100 conversations left unsaid. Finally, Claire nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "Okay. I'll step back." I wasn't sure if I believed her, but it was something. It was a start. Over the next few weeks, things did change. Claire stopped texting Eric as much, and when we saw her at social events, she kept her distance. Eric noticed, of course. Claire's been acting weird, he said one evening, frowning as he scrolled through his phone. She's giving us space, I said simply. He looked up at me, confusion etched across his face. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, bracing myself. I told her how I felt. About the two of you. About how much it's been affecting me. Eric stared at me, his expression unreadable. You talked to her? Without telling me. I had to, I said, meeting his gaze. Because I couldn't keep living like this, Eric. I couldn't keep feeling like I was sharing you. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he was angry. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, heavy sigh. I didn't realize, he said quietly. I didn't know it was hurting you this much. Well, now you do, I said, my voice soft but firm. And now we have to decide what we're going to do about it. Eric nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine. I want to fix this, he said. I want to fix us. It wasn't an answer, not really. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in months, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. In the days that followed, Eric and I started the slow, delicate work of piecing ourselves back together. It wasn't easy. The wounds were fresh, and the trust between us felt fragile, as if the slightest pressure might shatter it all over again. But there was effort on both sides, and that was more than I could say for the months before. Eric began to notice the small things that had slipped through the cracks of our relationship. The way my smile didn't quite reach my eyes. The way my laughter had grown quieter, more cautious. He started asking questions, real questions about how I was feeling and what I needed from him. And for the first time, I felt like he was listening, truly listening, instead of brushing my concerns aside. But even with all his efforts, Claire remained a shadow over us. Though she kept her distance, her presence lingered in the unspoken spaces of our conversations. Eric didn't bring her up as often, but when he did, it was careful, calculated, like he was testing the waters to see how much I could handle. I hated that she was still a part of the equation, even in her absence. One night, as we lay in bed, I finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at me for weeks. Do you miss her? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper in the dark. Eric shifted beside me, his body tense. What do you mean? You know what I mean, I said, turning to face him. Do you miss her? The way things were before. Before I asked her to step back. He sighed, his breath heavy with the weight of the question. I miss the simplicity of it, he admitted. Claire's always been easy. She knows me in a way that doesn't require explaining. And I don't. I asked, my throat tightening. That's not what I mean, he said quickly, reaching for my hand. You know me in ways she never could. But it's different. Claire and I have so much history, and with history comes comfort. It's like, I don't know, like slipping on an old jacket. It just fits. His words stung, even though I knew he didn't mean them to. I pulled my hand away, sitting up against the headboard. Do you realize how that sounds? I asked, my voice sharp. Like I'll never measure up because I don't have decades of inside jokes or shared memories. How am I supposed to compete with that? You're not supposed to compete, he said, sitting up too. His voice was earnest, his eyes pleading. Megan, you're my wife. You're the person I chose to spend my life with. Claire is just... She's a part of my past, yes, but you're my future. I need you to believe that. I want to, I said, my voice cracking. But it's hard when I feel like I'll always be second to her, even if you don't see it that way. Eric reached for me again, his hands warm and steady against mine. Then help me make it better, he said softly. Tell me what you need from me. That conversation was a turning point. Slowly we began to rebuild not just our relationship but also the way we communicated, the way we understood each other. Eric made an effort to create new traditions, new memories that were just ours. He planned spontaneous weekend trips, tried out new hobbies with me, even suggested we take dance lessons together. A hilariously awkward venture that left us both laughing until our sides ached. For my part, I worked on letting go of the resentment I'd been carrying. It wasn't easy, and some days were harder than others. But I realized that holding on to that anger was like drinking poison and expecting Eric, or Claire, to feel the effects. It was only hurting me. Claire, true to her word, stayed in the background. She still popped up occasionally, An invitation to a group dinner, a casual comment on one of Eric's social media posts, but it was clear she was keeping her distance. Part of me wanted to reach out to her, to see if there was a way to mend things between us. But another part of me wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Months passed, and life slowly began to feel normal again. Eric and I found a new rhythm, one that felt stronger, more intentional. We still had our moments of doubt, our moments of tension, but they no longer defined us. Instead, they became opportunities to grow, to understand each other better. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eric turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "I didn't realize how much I was taking you for granted, how much I was letting Claire's presence overshadow what we have." I looked at him, my chest tightening. "And now I see things more clearly," he said, reaching for my hand. "I see you. And I know I don't always say it, but I'm grateful for you. For us." His words warmed me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "I'm grateful too," I said softly. For the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. We still had a long way to go, and the scars of the past would always be there, faint but present. But we were moving forward step by step together. And that, I realized, was enough. As the seasons turned and time carried us forward, I began to feel the weight of those difficult months lifting, bit by bit. Eric and I had built something new out of the wreckage. Not the effortless marriage we once imagined, but a relationship forged through struggle, through honesty, and through hard choices. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Claire remained on the fringes of our lives, an occasional presence but no longer a force that loomed between us. Over time, the sharp edges of my resentment toward her dulled, though I never let myself forget the lessons I'd learned. People like Claire, people who share a deep, irreplaceable connection, will always have a place in the lives of those they've shaped. But it was up to Eric and me to decide what place she held, and for the first time I felt confident in where we stood. One evening, months after our darkest days, Eric and I found ourselves walking through the park near our home. The autumn leaves crunched under our feet, and the air was crisp and cool. We didn't talk much, we didn't need to. His hand in mine was enough. As we stopped at a bench overlooking a small pond, Eric pulled me close, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the ducks skim across the water. "You know," he said finally, his voice soft, "when I think about the future now, it's not the past that comes to mind. It's this. What we're building." I turned to him, my heart swelling with a quiet, steady warmth. "Me too," I said. And I meant it. There would always be echoes of Claire in his life and mine, but they no longer felt like a threat. She was part of his story, and I was part of his future. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of where we were headed. The shadows that had once haunted our marriage were fading, replaced by a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly choose each other, day after day. As I leaned into Eric, the world around us bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, I realized that love isn't about perfection or absence of doubt. It's about weathering the storms together, finding strength in the cracks and holding on, even when it feels like everything might fall apart. And so we held on,